Hello and welcome of Wise Words Book Summaries. Today we're continuing on with the fitness, and we're talking about, or we're summarising, The World's Fittest Book by Ross Edgley. I think some of you might know him as the guy who swam around England. He's also done other crazy feats that we'll probably touch on in this book. He's one of those people who's just got way too much energy and has to put it towards something, and so ends up doing these crazy feats. And he's, I would say he's quite a character. I've kind of known about him actually for a long time, even before, I think it was before the British Swim. I liked
and it was definitely before the books. It was definitely before 100%. He wrote the books. Because I remember you introducing me to him like ages ago, I think, back when he was just doing social media stuff, I think.
Yeah. I have no idea how I found out about him. I think I just saw a picture of him working out, and I was like, "Oh, I want a body like that." And then I followed him on Instagram, and then it came to that. But and now he's written
a well-built man.
And yes, you could say that again.
You can watch his physique. He's kind of almost like it sounds really bad, but almost like a gorilla. Like he's so top.
Yeah.
He's bottom heavy as well, but he's so, I don't know. There's just something about his physique. You're just like, Jesus Christ.
His but he's also not. He's not that big, so he's like.
But he's not that kind of like bodybuilder repulsive size. Do you kind of get what I mean? I find bodybuilders too big to be like. I look at that and I go, I don't want to be like that. But Ross Edgley's kind of like basically at the brink, I would say.
Hybrid.
But he's. We're going to touch on a few of his other books as well, aren't we? I think later on. I think we might do Blueprint,
probably at some point,
possibly, and then maybe even his book on motivation. He has a book, I can't remember what it was called, but I haven't read it yet. But
Resilience, is that one?
Yeah, I said The Art of Resilience or something. That's more about mindset and stuff, which we might touch on too. But this guy, as you'll probably hear about later on, is kind of a maniac as well. His climbing up the equivalent of going up Mount Everest but on a rope, and like just destroying his hands on the rope for like a day. It's just it's just crazy.
It's insane. For 19 hours or something. It was like and then what was it, pulling a car for a marathon, right? Like we've been talking about doing a marathon. Imagine pulling a fucking car.
And then he did the like equivalent of I want to say it might have been a triathlon, or it wasn't. It was a triathlon, but with a log. Holding a tree. Absolutely. He's a madman. Anyway, it's safe to say he's a fit guy. He knows what he's doing, and essentially this book is kind of sort of bringing up the principles of fitness, right? This is the whole point of his book, was to sort of make a more general book that covers everything and kind of sieves through the bullshit of the fitness industry, because there's a lot of it out there, and I've definitely believed some of it in the past, and I've applied it to my training and not found any results. And he kind of gives you the sort of toolkit for how to develop fitness in all the different areas that you could possibly want. And to me, I quite liked his like no nonsense sort of like, at the end of the day, it is just a level of putting in the work and just doing it over time. He's like, there's no simple answers other than actually doing the work. And if anybody can promise you, fitness results without doing some form of fitness training, for a long period of time, they're definitely bullshitting you, or they got something to sell you. It's but I quite enjoyed that. I've come full circle through this. I've done my fair share of listening to the bullshit that floats around, and now I've come back to realize that sometimes you just need a wise man to tell you that it's harder than it looks, and that there's not really a nice answer that you want to hear apart from do the work.
No, exactly. I think the thing that attracted me towards him most at the very beginning was kind of this. He would just talk about the kind of fundamentals, right? The principles, rather than like, get a 6-pack in 6 weeks. These kind of like, bite-sized cookie cutter ways of like becoming fit, because I felt that was bullshit. And so that's why I was attracted to this idea of these principles. And I think that's why I think I listened to his book like years ago. I don't think I actually read it, but now here we are, and we've read it and we've summarized it, and now we're gonna chat about it on the podcast.
Sweet. Okay, well, should we get into it?
Yeah, let's do it. There was a random point, I don't know why I brought it up at the very beginning. It was just this quote, like, how old would you be if you didn't know how old you were? And I just thought that was a weird point, as in, like, because we kind of touched on it a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about metabolism, and like a metabolic age, and what if you were to, like, your age would be based on your metabolism. I thought that was quite interesting. But
I thought it was more interesting as well, because it's not just the physicality of it, it's sort of like the mindset of it as well. Like, how old would you think you actually are if you didn't know your own age? Like, if you had to guess, imagine if you weren't actually keeping count, and you wouldn't be able to cross compare, because you wouldn't actually know how old anybody else's is. So you'd be like, oh, how old are you? They'd be like, I don't know, I'm pretty old. I've been around a long time. Well, I just thought,
but that's what he did with that. He did it when he was like in Ecuador or something with some people who like wrestle bulls or horses or something. And he said, like, how old are you? And this guy was like, I don't know, I turned 50.
That's it.
A while ago, and then
like
I stopped
70 or something, or 50. It might have been younger, But I quite like that concept as well. So what's the point of counting anymore? Because the only thing it's going to do is depress you a little bit, right? And I kind of realized that at some point there is little value to be gained from counting the age, because it will almost
well, there's a self-fulfilling
create expectations. Yeah, exactly. It'll create expectations, around it. Like, I'm getting old, it means I can't do fitness anymore. But if you don't keep track of it, you'll be like, well, I'm just going to keep doing it until my body says no. Yeah. If that kind of makes sense. Exactly. And from what we kind of know now from reading lots of these fitness books, fitness doesn't. I mean, obviously, it does decline with age, but it doesn't decline as much as people make out it does. But from Daniel Lieberman's exercise, we do have the capacity to put in a lot of work at a reasonably old age. And the one thing that actually puts us into not working out is that expectation that I'm 65 now, I should be having my pension, I should be retiring, I should be like putting my feet up and not exercising, I should walk less, do less. No,
absolutely. A bit of a random start, but I just thought that was an interesting point. So jumping into the book, I think it kind of started off like I was just saying, in this book, he kind of touches on the principles and the foundations, these like fundamental aspects. And so he kind of starts off the book saying that. So he says, too many people see the idea of fitness as fixed doctrine, a set of infallible laws they must religiously follow. Instead, fitness is vast, malleable, and fluid, and a fluid concept. Within it, there are thousands of ideas you can learn, ignore, adopt, and discard. And once again, we've constantly talked about the individuality, personal differences, and all of that needs to be taken into consideration when we're talking about fitness. And that's why it has to be this kind of broad, malleable concept. He then talks about the 10 components on fitness. And we've kind of come across this with Andy Galpin, and I would say Andrew Huberman, listening to that kind of podcast. There are a few different ones here, but essentially they are cardio, respiratory endurance, muscular endurance, strength, speed, power, flexibility, coordination, agility, balance, and accuracy. Which I think is just quite important. Like, if you don't know that they are like these key components to just be aware of, right?
And what's interesting is you can actually train each individual component, right? And I feel like a lot of people, if they looked at themselves in the mirror seriously, they'd realize that they are missing some components completely, I would say. I mean, even looking at myself, I'm missing multiple, really. Like, I don't do anything to do with to balance. Like, I don't do anything to do with flexibility. Coordination, I like to think by playing regular sport, I'm kind of training coordination, but I'm not doing anything out of what I'm already coordinated to do, if that makes sense. So I'm not actually training, for example, if I did something like dance, I feel like I'd be training a different type of coordination with my body, if that makes sense. I'm doing different movements. And I feel like all of us probably have some part of that 10 components of fitness, which we're neglecting, or if not, just never even doing. I mean, even speed, to be honest, I'm not doing like sprint training. But it's just interesting because obviously it just goes to show, if you think you're somebody who's like maxed it out, like you're amazing at something, well, you've got another probably 8 or 9 components that you could be looking at here.
Exactly. And I think, fitness. But you're also never going to be able to like reach this max of all of them at the same time. There's a trade-off to an extent, right? Like, you can't train all of them at once because you'll spread yourself too thin. Essentially, that's why people kind of go through these different transitions over the year. They might focus on strength and then power and then hypertrophy or whatnot, and then try and find ones that combine together and work well
sport
together.
Specific type stuff as well, right? You know, for example,
absolutely,
you might not need speed as much if you're doing something which is based in endurance, right? Like, so to speak, if you're doing long distance running, speed is less important, I guess you could say. And some of the other things matter less. So it all really depends on what you are, what your goals are, right? And this is why, you know, a one size fits all fitness solution isn't correct for everybody. You know, everybody has their own different objectives, you know, lifestyles. What do they want to achieve with what they're trying to do? You know, I feel like a lot of people, right? They go into the gym at the beginning of the new year, kind of with like a rough goal of, you know, lose a couple of pounds, gain a bit of muscle, maybe. But I mean, that's probably not specific enough, really, to create a proper training program, really. And maybe it's not like a long-standing goal either in my head. It will just eventually you'll do that, you'll achieve it, and then you'll be like, okay, what's next? And unless you set yourself another goal, you know, you're bound to end up heading back to where you once were.
Yeah. No, precisely. Like, I remember listening to this thing about Andrew Schwarzenegger, and he was saying, you know, the reason why he was so successful is just because he had such a clear goal. Every day he would constantly refine it, right? And so he knew what he was doing. He knew every step, or every time that he would go to the gym, he was getting like one step closer, and how he needed to change to make sure that he was on track.
I do think that's
having a goal, I think, is very, very good.
Yeah, these elite athletes get to their level, because if you think about it, if your goal is literally to become like an elite athlete, because you have that in your mind every day, you know, every day of training is meaningful. So therefore, you're willing to put in work, you know, because every day you actually put in the work, it means something, because you're progressing towards that goal, right? It's almost like that you get a dopamine hit because you've shown to yourself you made progress. Whereas if somebody doesn't have those aspirations, let's just say they don't have an aspiration of, I want to be the best version of myself, then I can understand why people might fall out of love with doing the work, if that makes sense.
Yes. No, absolutely. I think
so. That's why most people give up, you know, because they don't have that end vision.
And like, you know, we've talked about this a lot in terms of habits, but the element of like willpower, right? And I wonder if your goal, if what you're doing, for instance, when you're going to the gym, for example, and doing whatever you do, becomes detached from your goal because you don't have it as well clarified in your mind, then because it's detached, you require more kind of willpower as such. Yeah. And why people might burn out. Whereas like if it's linked, you've got more motivation. It's there. You know on why you're doing it. There's more depth.
On a complete side note to the book, the Dopamine podcast, which we were talking about before with like Peterson and Andrew Huberman, and then there's another Andrew Huberman one just on dopamine. It would make sense that somebody who has a vision or a goal, and that every workout contributes to that goal, and they can see, even if it isn't every time, some form of progress, they will feel such pleasant, you know, emotions related to that workout that is going to keep them going again and again and again. And maybe they will burn out, but they might even see burnout as part of the process to reach the goal, and therefore it becomes a positive thing in their life in comparison to somebody else who might, you know, not have a clear-cut goal. Then every single workout doesn't actually mean anything. The dopamine response isn't triggered because there's nothing that in that reward system that's, you know, you're almost like, oh, why am I doing this? Why am I putting myself through pain? You know, you ask yourself these questions when you're doing it, and then unless the reason's big enough, or unless the goal is clear, you're highly likely to, you know, give up with these sort of, with the fitness journey, let's just say, or the gym going, etc. And I feel like that's probably why a lot of people do give up. It's less like willpower, because willpower gets you somewhere. But I do think it's a level of like becoming to enjoy the process, because you've got a larger goal where everything means something in relation to that, if that makes sense.
And you can only kind of enjoy the process if you have a goal in the first place that you can connect.
I think so. And I think the ultimate meta goal, in a weird way as well, I think we may have touched on this before, I swear, but like being the best version of yourself to a degree is the ultimate meta goal, because therefore everything you do, which is improving yourself, is therefore meaningful, right? So you can have that in all areas of your life, right? Which is because I think Huberman talks a lot about that with Carol Dweck's like growth mindset. So if you can get into the mindset that everything that improves you is meaningful and good, you can then make yourself do things that most people wouldn't want to do because it has meaning now for you. That's positive, you know. I'm learning this, or I'm going to the gym and I worked out. That means I'm improving my fitness. You get what I mean? Like you almost sell yourself on this, and you end up becoming like almost like not addicted, but you come like you just become to enjoy the pain of the work, if that makes sense. Yeah. Whereas some other people be like, why the hell is that guy working now, or why is he doing this? It's just because he sees meaning in it. If that that makes sense.
Absolutely. I think David Goggins is probably like a prime example of that. Someone who just doesn't really give much rest. And he literally is like, you know, I work out every single day, and someone
and he
will
like grinded his like cartilage in his knees.
Oh man, he's crazy. But he sees, like you just said, he sees meaning in working out every day and
in the pain
for
like
2 hours and in the pain, right?
He sees meaning in all of that. He sees meaning in like what do you call it, like over or surpassing his biological responses. So like if his biology tells him like you should probably stop, he sees like fast, like I don't know, he must get a massive dopamine rush from it that keeps him going, but he gets meaning from that. And to be fair, in that Dopamine Nation, in that Dopamine Nation book I just read, she even says you can become addicted to pain. Because if pain becomes rewardable in your head, like you reward yourself for the pain and for overcoming the pain, you can actually get addicted to pain.
No, absolutely.
Sorry. The only thing I'd add to that as well is because she talks a lot about how pain and pleasure is like a balance, so you can't have one without the other. So if you sustain yourself in pleasure all the time, that's when you trough down into pain and become depressed. Exactly that. So that's why you can get addicted to pain, because you spend so much time in the below. The moment you don't have the pain, you shoot up into like a euphoric state, and then you get addicted to becoming into the pain state to get to that euphoric pleasure state, which is probably part of it.
And I think there's so much to capitalize on the fact that you can create a relationship with anything. You get to kind of determine what relationship you have with something. Someone who is in pain, right, might dislike that pain. If David Goggins has now created a relationship whereby he enjoys the pain, then he willingly goes into it. He willingly tries to reach that kind of state. And I think, there's a lot to be said for that once again, going on your point about the whole like dopamine, is that you can program yourself to essentially like or back yourself with doing things. Anyway, back on track. So
a massive detour, but I think it was relevant. It was relevant.
No, I think so. Yeah. So he talks about the law of biological individuality. And he says that however alike we may be in many ways, our physiologies hold so many differences that each of us is truly biologically unique. And this was just touching on what we were just saying in terms of, the individual differences. Although we share 99% of our genes with one another, that 1% also accounts to quite a lot. He also touches on this idea that, because he's talking about, sifting through all the bullshit like you were talking about with the whole fitness industry. And just as, in psychology, you have, I think it's like 72% of studies can't be replicated. I think it's very similar in fitness. And we're reading this book at the moment, aren't we? Good to Go, which kind of touches on this element that it's actually quite difficult to measure a lot of fitness like studies, because a lot of the metrics that are being used aren't actually measuring the things that the studies are attempting to try and find out.
I'm very excited to review that book in a few weeks. So if anybody's listening to this, they'll be so interested to hear some of the stuff that goes on in the, in the sort of scientific studies for sports, etc. Because once you realize what how the studies are structured, you start realizing that it's not really that comprehensive and bulletproof, so to speak, with the science. So.
Exactly. So he just has a little point here that says 51% of printed fitness cannot be trusted. It's misleading, misinformed, and wrongly mass broadcasted as solutions to all. And I think when he means like printed fitness, he means like, all these fitness industries going, oh, you need to do this or you need to do that. And
as you'll find out in the Good to Go book, like a lot of these fitness related sort of like advice and solutions are based upon people who had vested interest in the scientific studies which showed these things, like as we see, like electrolytes, all of it, even the what I thought was interesting, I don't know if you got to this part yet, but the protein anabolic window, like that was invented by somebody who came up with the original recovery shake. So the idea of having protein within this, like a short time after working out,
it makes sense.
There was a vested interest to have it. And basically, I can't remember what they did. They did a control against, I think, people who had nothing to eat or something. And obviously, anybody who ate something within like some time after working out was going to have better gains. It's crazy. But yeah.
No, it is really interesting. And this kind of like builds into his next point, basically saying that like the reason why a lot of this has come about, in addition to, having vested interest from like companies and stuff like that, is that people want this like easy to understand, simple solution, right? They want to know that they could get a 6-pack in 6 weeks. They want an easy answer. And that kind of like, even if like, Yeah, and we want to convince ourselves that we can, that we just want it. And
it's like magical thinking, but we all wish the world worked like that, you know, sort of we can get what we desire very quickly. Like it'd be nice if the world worked like that. And obviously if there was a chance that it does work like that, we'd try our best to take it, which is almost why these sales pitches work so well, because you'd be an idiot not to get a six-pack in 6 weeks if the other person's telling you it takes 2 years. Like, why would you?
Exactly.
You know,
no, it is funny. That's why, like, I took this quote that he also had in there from Nassim Taleb, and it was basically just saying that we humans, facing limits of knowledge and things we do not observe, the unseen and the unknown, resolve the tension by squeezing life and the world into crisp, commoditized ideas, reductive categories, specific vocabularies, and prepackaged narratives. And I just thought that was quite a good quote that he had in there. And then on to this next part. So we just kind of, it's a basic kind of table that's kind of explaining the different components that we were talking about in terms of, you know, strength, power, hypertrophy, and endurance, and just what kind of like rep ranges, sets, and stuff like that. We'll probably include that on the book summary. So if you want to check that out, you can go ahead and do so. And then, on to the next part. Do you want to start?
Yeah, go for it. Then we moved on to part 1, the 5 laws of fitness, and he had a little pyramid infographic.
He loves his little pyramids, doesn't he?
He does. I swear, all he did is all the book have pyramids and levels of things. And he's kind of done it similar to, I guess what you could say was what is the nutrition pyramid as well. So like at the bottom of the pyramid, you have like the most important, the foundation. So I believe it's carbohydrates, but as we'll find out when we start doing some of these nutrition books, it shouldn't be carbohydrates. But anyway, the foundation or the most important part is at the bottom. And then each layer up you go, it's more and more specific, you could say, and less important. So at the bottom, he has the law of the body basics. Then on like the one above it, he has the law of progressive overload. Then above that, he has the law of specific skill. As you can see, it's now getting more specific. Then the one above that is the law of recovery. And to be honest, I wonder if that could be put below, but we'll go on to that later. Then you have the law of more, which is essentially in my head also another form of progressive overload. And then he has some other smaller ones at the very top. So he has like losing fat, building strength, increasing speed, and improving endurance. But what he's trying to say here is these stuff at the top, which is kind of what we all assume to be like the fitness goals itself, should come later to like setting the foundations of fitness, so to speak. So like you shouldn't go straight into chasing speed. You shouldn't go straight into the hypertrophy. You should look into the building the foundations of your body first, which I thought was a really interesting approach, because most people, you know, they just want to jump straight into the gym. They want to get as muscly as possible, as quick as possible. They forget that actually a lot of it should be about, you know, building up from a solid foundation. And there's always that classic, like, you know, there's always like classic quotes around sort of building on sand rather or building on concrete. You know, there's a difference between the two.
No, absolutely. I think it's quite interesting because, you know, in psychology, we're taught about how, you know, in our early years, we're very like malleable and we can adapt very well. And so there's almost an idea that, well, maybe should we specialize at such an early age then? Should we get someone into doing, you know, a high jump like we were talking about in the Sports Gene, right? That guy, I can't remember his name, Stephen Holmes,
I think, or something like that, yeah.
Yeah, who like, you know, was doing high jump from the age of 3, right? So you're going to be specializing in that. But there's also an idea that, or which he goes on to talk about in this next part, so the law of body basics and this general physical preparedness is this idea of like building that foundation of loads of broad kind of movements, loads of broad, like, you know, jumping. I think he says here it's like jumping, almost climbing,
like full body movements, right? Something that just doesn't involve, you know, because most people go to the gym and they just do, you know, very isolated movements. He's talking more about full body, get your functional, get your coordination sort of going as well. Yeah.
And that's exactly it, right? Is like, so this idea behind general physical preparedness is that you're training the kind of neural circuits, the neural movements. Your brain essentially is just trying to get the movements in first, and then you can start to specialize about how you apply that movement into like a specific sport maybe, right? But as long as you've kind of got the basics down, then you can build on top of that. And I thought it was quite interesting because I've come across this idea. I think I was listening to a podcast or something, or an interview with this guy who used to coach the US gymnastics team. And gymnastics is very about like, you know, hitting all those kind of like foundational elements. And he was saying, you know, I could take one of my gymnasts and put him into any sport and he'd probably be above average. You know, he'd be pretty good at taking it on. Whereas if I took like a rugby player and put him into gymnastics, he'd fail. Right.
Well, you know,
and it is this idea that like, you know,
there is a level of cross, like there's a level where if you can get your body into a specific state, I guess you could say, where it's very good at almost everything in every single movement direction, right? You are going to be better than somebody who's hyper specialized. Unless of course the thing is very hyper specialized, right? So if it's sprinting, for example, you're probably not going to be able to beat a sprinter, but you're probably going to be able to beat a lot of people who don't do sprinting just by basically having the you know, everything being trained for. And I definitely think it's something we all neglect, I guess, even in the current like schooling system and everything that we have. You know, we start playing a range of sports, I guess you could say, across the year from a young age, but you don't all at the same time. You kind of like one season you're doing rugby, let's just say, this is in the UK system. One season you're doing like hockey or football, or whatever, and then another season you're doing cricket or whatever. You know, I guess you are doing a bit of everything, but there's no real like balance. You don't do anything other than those sports, but those sports neglect a lot of other things, you know, in my head at least.
Absolutely.
Training.
Absolutely. And I think like, you know, so he goes on to say like essentially a general physical preparedness is a training program that encourages athletes to perform a variety of exercises such as squats, lunges, jumps, climbs, presses, and throws with a focus on a high volume and frequency. And the idea of that is, once again, to embed these kind of neurological pathways so that your body gets used to these movements. And I think you probably get a lot of that from just doing athletics, right? You'd be engaging in like a lot of running, sprinting, endurance, high jump, low, you know, long jump. So you're engaging in a lot of those things. But you're right. I think we do compartmentalize them and basically always focus on a sport rather than just like general.
Yeah, there was never a point, you know, where you go,
right?
Here's, exactly. Well, I guess you had like PE, but then it was never really like, you know, I guess that's probably the purpose it probably tried to serve, if that makes sense. It tried to be that, but it wasn't, if that makes sense also. I feel like we weren't doing all these different movements. You know, I don't remember one time doing squats at PE, but maybe that's because my memory of being young is very like, you know, faulty, but
yes. Well, yeah, no, I can't remember either, to be honest. Like I remember doing gymnastics a little bit when I was a kid for like a term, and I think that was about it. But yeah, I do actually think this is probably a good way to go about it. Because it also just like think about how many people who don't find the sport, right, that they really like, and so they're just like, but also maybe they've been put in too early or something like that. Exactly.
But you got what I mean? Exactly. Maybe they've been put into things too early before they built the coordination. Because as we've, you know, you've already touched on earlier in this book, but also in the sports team, people respond to different types of training differently, right? And some people are slower to pick up things than others, you know. And maybe what we do sometimes, we rush people into it and like, oh, you're useless. You know, he's not very good within 2 weeks. He's no talent. But the reality is, if they just consistently did it over time and time again, eventually they get there, you know?
Yes, no, absolutely. So yeah, and like in the book, he kind of, the way that he comes across this is he was talking to some Russian guy in Siberia. I don't know why.
I do love Ross Edgley's stories, to be fair. Like this one thing this book does well is he has like obviously valuable fitness information, but there's always like coated within like a rogue story where he's in like another country with like some sort of Russian bear, or this is how he describes the guy, right? And like,
no, I thought it was really funny, but
he is funny.
Yeah, just this idea that like the Russians kind of apply this to like, I think maybe they're equivalent to like PE, but essentially there was this program called the Process of Achieving Sports Mastery, and it applied exactly this as like a preparatory like kind of phase before they would go on and specialize in certain like kind of sports. And I just thought I would actually like to read around that and know like what kind of, because I would love to hit those basics, right? I'd love to actually like kind of improve on that, because I'm not like doing a specific sport anymore, so I would like to be quite like, you know, have some general ability. I think it'd be interesting to read around.
100%.
So then he goes on to talk about this kinesthetic awareness, which is essentially just knowing where your body is in space. And this can kind of help you in two different ways. So one of them is like, so it means a better understanding of when the movements you're doing feels right or wrong. So this kind of biological feedback helps you make adjustments to perform the movements better and more efficiently. And I think this is actually really key. And I think people actually really struggle with kinesthetic awareness. I think you look at people and they they can't walk properly, or they don't have good posture, or, when they're performing certain movements in the gym, they have no idea that oh, this is feeling bad or that's feeling bad. It just...
You see a lot of people, don't you, doing specific exercises. You watch them and you think, wow, you are not doing that correctly. You're going to hurt yourself if you keep doing that. The amount of people I see doing flies where they're doing some weird, I don't even...
Oh my God, yeah.
I'm just what is going on? But yeah, I think it's quite interesting as well. So on the topic of kinesthetic awareness, that I don't know if you've ever been or ever had this before, where you've been coached with something, but a coach tells you to imagine something. Imagine you're doing this with your body, and then all of a sudden you can find the correct, correct movement, posture, correct movement, transition, or whatever you want to call it. We've been listening to that. I think Jeffrey Jeremy Imer, the Either, maybe
I think
is that his name? Okay, yeah, he does lots of fitness videos on correct form for exercises, and he did something I think we were talking about the other day with chest flies, where it's when you get to the top, try and squeeze your elbows together, right? And I never once contemplated that before, but this idea that you can prime yourself to realize or to become aware of these feelings helps you with these moves. And I just thought it's such an easy way to improve on something within this sort of weightlifting or overall fitness, because obviously a lot of people do things in the wrong way because they've never been taught, or they've watched somebody else do it and then they think what they do is that without any feedback to correct them.
Yes,
because you can't watch yourself, right?
Unless no, exactly.
Which is the sole purpose of mirrors in a gym in my head, or it should be the sole purpose. They're there to correct your own movements.
Yeah, no, I would think so. And that's exactly what the second part is, this idea of and I love this term, better physiological intuition, right? And I think intuition is key, right? You feeling, first of all, without, if you don't have external cues, such as a coach, then it's oh, does this feel right? I've never squatted before. Let's say I'd never watched a video before. What feels kind of right? And the same thing goes for people have terrible biological intuition when they dance. When you look at people who can't dance, it's so obvious that they can't move properly, or they don't know what feels good or anything like that. And I thought that was really interesting. And then exactly what you were talking about in terms of the coaching aspect. If you have a good kind of physiological intuition, then you can receive these external cues from coaches much better. And it probably goes on to what we were talking about with the sports gene, this idea of being receptive to, or a good responder, right? A good responder to training. I wonder whether that's because there's an element of physiological intuition there. And you're able to respond much better,
Yeah, it's interesting as well about this idea of responding better to training. So obviously there was that study done on people who were training to come up with this idea, right? But I wonder if the study was done and made sure all of them did the exact same form as well. You know what I mean? So when you're doing a scientific experiment, obviously you're meant to control for as many things as possible. So I wonder with these exercise ones, were they actually making sure these people are doing the form correctly? Because that in my head would also affect the physiological response to exercise, right? If you're doing it so you're actually doing an exercise which is properly training the muscle group you want to, in comparison to somebody who might be leveraging other muscle groups, you might have a difference in response to that. But how can you control for that, right? This is why the science of exercise is so hard. It's almost like a pipe dream, really. You can draw some level of conclusions from it, but you can never be sure, right? And it's just interesting.
Exactly. And I think it probably also adds to that element of the law of biological individuality, right? Because you all be doing the right form, but then you also need to be able to adapt that form to your body, right? There isn't such thing as a perfect form, because it's based on the individual.
Of course,
and so you might find that people who excel better, even though they're all doing the same form, is because they're able to make it theirs, essentially. And they have that intuition to be okay, this is a good guideline, but I'm going to tweak this because this is how my arm moves or whatnot, you know.
This is all to say that the first section obviously is all about, you know, building up this foundation. So part of the foundational training then is, like you said, going back to functional or more complete movements, squat, lunges, etc. Making sure you're performing the movements correctly before you even begin to load up weight. And this can be, obviously, in my head, if you were looking to do this from this podcast, you can obviously just check out somebody who does form-based exercise videos where they tell you about how to focus on the correct form, etc. I believe Ross Edgley definitely had a workout plan made around this, I think, as well. And I don't know if you got that in your notes, or if not, buy the book. And he definitely has some sort of 12-week exercise program for sort of all-round basic fitness, involving, you know, lots and lots of reps of lightweight. But yeah, it's something that, to be honest, I'm actually going to look into doing myself, because I feel like I've overtrained, and I feel like it'd be good to go back to the very basics and lift really light, but just making sure every single time I'm doing these exercises, the form is like immaculate. And then start adding weight again, you know, starting from the foundations again, because I feel like a lot of people think they're doing stuff correctly and they're just not, you know, and they're asking for an injury in the long run.
100%. I mean, like, and what I find really interesting is that, I'll give myself as an example. I'm struggling to squat at the moment, right? And so the beginning bit, when I'm like, you know, just warming up and I've got low weights, I find it fine, and I can do the you know, the motion, the movement, and it feels right. And then as soon as I go up to like a level that's hitting strength, it's clearly too much for me. And what I find really interesting is that if you think about it neurologically, it's mapping a different movement when you're struggling. It's saying this is how it should be, rather than this is how it should be, right? And so you really want to just fucking nail that movement, low weight, high reps, loads of, you know, and then you once you've mapped that neurological like pathway and that movement, then you can start putting on the weight, because you're less likely to kind of go off the trajectory.
It just makes sense, doesn't it, really? Like it does make sense neurologically as well. You're mapping the incorrect movement, because you have to do that like sort of compensatory movement to get it up, right? Because you're not strong enough. Essentially, is basically what it is. You're not strong enough to do the correct movement, so therefore you're compensating. And to be fair, I guess if you're always pushing the boundary of where your strength is, you're going to have some form of that, because I don't think you're ever going to get rid of that. But you shouldn't be completely changing your form to, you know, do a rep. So
exactly. And I always use this metaphor that I think was from that book about psychedelics or something. I can't remember what it was called. The New Science of Psychedelics, but this idea that, like, you know, think of it like a hill with a layer of snow, and you keep going down the same path, like going on a sled down the same pathway. So you build this kind of like path, and if you try and go on a different, like at a different angle, you'll just slide back into that same pathway. And I think of it like this, right? If I've nailed this fucking movement of how to squat, then whenever I'm like slightly changing, or you know, I'm putting my weight up, then I'm more likely to sit back into that correct mapping, rather than if I'm just jumping into it too quickly. So onto the
law of progressive overload. So this kind of, I would assume, maybe not everybody has heard of this law or heard of the term, but progressive overload is essentially gradually increasing weight, volume, intensity, frequency, or time training in order to achieve a specific goal. So this is when you're doing a sort of fitness program or anything related to a specific sport, and you are changing one of the variables I just said. So you're increasing the weight when you're doing some form of weight training. You're increasing the volume. So that would basically mean the sheer amount of repetitions, for example, that you're doing. Increasing the intensity, which is, you know, how high a percentage of the 1 rep max you're lifting, so how heavy it is essentially. You've got the frequency, so the amount of times you're training per week, and that can even be how many times you're training a muscle group per week. You've got time training here, which to me is part of the sort of, you know, volume or frequency. So if you're, you know, doing more workouts more frequently and with higher volume, you're going to increase your overall time training. It's basically to say that the only way you're going to impose adaptation, so muscle growth or whatever you're looking for in the long run, you need to be making sure you're progressively doing more of any of these variables to shock your body or to damage your body. Essentially is the crux of it, for it then to overcompensate and repair at a stronger level.
Absolutely, couldn't have said it better myself. Bloody hell. And then this concept of progressive overload kind of ties in this idea of this concept of homeostasis, which I'm assuming most people have kind of heard of, but it's essentially this kind of level, this balanced level that our bodies stay in. And it's kind of like, if we're talking about the biological aspect of it, you have two nervous systems. You've got your parasympathetic nervous system and your sympathetic nervous system. And your sympathetic nervous system, when that's activated, it's like your fight and flight. So a lot of your processes, such as like digesting and things like that, they kind of shut off so that more energy can be given to, my eyes are going to dilate so I can take in more stimuli. So, if I'm getting chased by a tiger 100,000 years ago, then, I'm ready to run or fight. But, and then the parasympathetic nervous system is obviously the opposite. And this is, responsible for these kind of much slower processes that are just as vital, but aren't so much when we're like under attack, and so this idea of homeostasis is this mechanism that helps us come back to a balanced state, which is crucial.
It's a bit like what we were saying before about the pain and pleasure, right? Like the idea is that if you have too much pleasure, it's not good for you. So that's why then when you stop, you have a big sort of injection of pain, so to speak. Or it's not exactly like that, but there's a balance to be had between the two, right? And to be fair, one of the main points of that book I was reading is that we've become so obsessed with chasing pleasure that we've forgotten the value of pain, which is just quite an interesting side point as well. Because if you've become adapted for pleasure, it means anything that's not pleasurable is therefore painful. And it's funny that we find ourselves in this, like our body is always looking to hit back, like you just said, to this sort of like baseline position. But I also thought there's a point here you got about this idea that to be truly stable, you have to be modifiable or adaptable, which I thought was quite interesting. So to allow stability, you have to be able to go above and below. And to be fair, when we get on to doing, because I know we're thinking about doing it in the future, the Nassim Taleb's books, this is pretty much his concept of anti-fragile, which is like stressors improve the system. So things that cause you to go below or above the homeostasis help you rebound and help you grow stronger. And as long as they don't break you, you're going to improve. But systems that are fragile, so systems that like rely on being exactly the same all the time and can't deal with little drops and ups, end up shattering and breaking, and therefore they're not almost not conducive to life, because you never know what's going to be thrown at you.
Absolutely. And I think that's key in terms of like the progressive overload that you're applying has to be relative, right, to whatever you're talking about, whether that's strength or muscle hypertrophy or anything. If I suddenly
minor stressor, I want to say it's got to be a minor stressor.
And I think there's a study here, but we don't need to go through it. But the idea is that, like, essentially giving rats a tiny bit of poison over a long period of time. And so they built up their tolerance of it. So a normal amount that would normally kill a rat that hadn't had this progressive overload of poison would normally die, but this one doesn't. And that's an important point, is that it has to be incremental. Because I would just snap and die. And
but there's just so many instances of that. Interestingly, I wonder if jumping from certain heights, so let's say there's a certain height you can fall from and it just breaks your legs right now, but if over time you slowly did jumps incrementally of like 10 centimeters higher every time, I wonder if eventually you get to the point where that wouldn't break your legs because you've trained yourself to be a bit like more adaptable to the impact. I reckon that in theory that should work. I don't know if they ever test that because of the inhumanity of it, but
Well, I think you can look at a lot of, like, for instance, a lot of parkour runners, right? And they, like, I follow a couple, and they will jump from a height that you're like, how are your knees not snapping? And I think whatever muscles, as long as you're like landing with good form and and you've been doing it like incrementally, then essentially those muscles and those joints, as long as it's not surpassing the biological threshold of what they can take, the amount of stress that they can take, then I think you probably can adapt, and you can, increase the height or the length or whatever.
I think that's almost self-explanatory to a degree. Like as long as it's not going to the point where you're jumping off like a skyscraper, I think there's obviously some level where you can improve your ability to not take, I guess you could say, not take damage. That's like everything. I mean, that's essentially what weightlifting is to a degree. You're slowly improving the ability to not take damage from heavy weights.
No, absolutely. So he's got a point here. So when an organism is exposed to a stimulus to the quality or intensity of which it is not adapted, it responds with a reaction which has been termed the general adaptation syndrome. To improve, you must expose your body to specific stimulus to the quality or intensity of which it is not adapted. At times, you might not like disrupting your comfy state of homeostasis. And I thought that was just an interesting point. There's like, we like to be in a comfortable state. We don't want to venture either way. We want to just remain balanced. But actually, like you were saying, we need kind of stresses. We need a bit of harm now and then to kind of like push us beyond. So just one that we're better equipped when things that we can't predict occur, right? We're better able to respond in an appropriate manner rather than it being so overwhelming. And you could say that that's, a lot to do with our society today and how we've been sensitized and mollycoddled, and now we can't, take it.
There's something to be said for kids running around in the mud, right? There's the argument for like allowing them to be exposed to germs, right? Because essentially that's what a vaccine does, right? It's putting germs into your system so your body can develop a sort of immunity to it, right? At small doses. And there becomes a part where if you don't, let your children or let people be exposed to specific, bacteria and viruses, they're never going to build up the immune response because you're just protecting them for everything. You're sanitizing everything. And therefore, when something actually does come across, and because they haven't built up this progressive overload of defense, so to speak, they just get wiped out with the smallest dose.
Absolutely. Like I remember Jonathan Haidt in his book, The Mollycoddling of the American Minds or something, and he used the example of like nut allergies and how if you ban it at school, actually more people end up developing nut allergies because they haven't been exposed to these slight irritants, right? And I think I think this concept can be applied in so many different realms. On a psychological realm, we're unable now to tolerate insults or people and I think that's really interesting. And obviously you could apply it on a biological level.
You can apply it to the sociological level in the sense of like corporations as well, like stresses that take out companies are meant to take out companies for the survival of the fittest almost, right? The whole point of capitalism is if stuff goes completely wrong and it hasn't hedged itself well enough to not survive a specific stressor, then it should be let to die out, and this is kind of why there's all these politics around like bank rescuing banks, etc., because it's like, well, they failed the test of capitalism, so should you save them?
Absolutely.
And that's where it gets a bit political, but like these processes of like stresses and minor adaptations, like the whole point as well for business, if you have a bad year, you're meant to adapt to the stressor of, okay, what went wrong, how do we improve, right? Like this is kind of how everything almost works to some degree. It's as long as it doesn't wipe you out or kill you, you're meant to build up and be better for it, so to speak. But as long as the dosage is right, as long as like you said, the stresses not too much. And I think he talks about it later on, but I have to mention now this idea of like minor stresses day on day and progressive overload, about like that parable of Milo and the cow. Like he basically had a baby calf and every day he would like put it on his back and walk with it until the point where he was carrying a full-on like cow on his back. And obviously I didn't know if it's true or not, but I thought that was quite an interesting or quite like a visual representation of this, where like if you just keep doing the same thing again and again, it slowly gets bigger. Like obviously this guy wouldn't be able to pick up a cow by himself from the get-go, but because the calf is growing, I guess, in some form, which the calves and animals tend to grow quite quickly when they hit sort of like, I guess what you could call for teenage years or whatever. But either way, the point being is, as long as you don't try the sort of 200 kg bench press from the start and you slowly build your way up, you're highly likely to get there over time in comparison to somebody who tries it from the start and breaks their arms.
Absolutely. And I think what you were talking about, just as long as it's like incremental, ties in this idea, obviously like gym talk essentially, but this idea of overtraining, and that's when you end up pushing your body too far. And this can be, we mentioned all those variables before in terms of weight, volume, intensity, frequency, and time training. And so overtraining can apply to any one of those, right? Like you put too much weight on, you put, you've been doing too many reps, or you've been going to the gym too much, and all this kind of essentially stresses your central nervous system, and you can get tired, right? Or your muscles are too fatigued that, you haven't allowed for enough time to recover. And so, essentially you need to listen to your body, right? And if you are applying this progressive overload, which you should, then it should be incremental.
Yeah. And then he goes on here to sort of talk as well about this sort of general adaptation syndrome. So there's 3 theoretical stages of this. You have the shock phase. So this is when you've, just worked out. So you're stiff and sore. This is the immediate response to the stress caused by training. Often there's a reduction in performance that occurs at this phase, and that's typically known that the fitter you are, the greater the stress and stimuli needed to induce the shock for the shock phase, right? And it's true. I mean, look, if you go and do like a heavy workout, you're not going to be able to go and do a heavy workout in 30 minutes time, even if it's a different muscle group, because you've taxed your system, right? And this is the shock phase. And then you've got this second part, which is still theoretical. It's the adaptation phase. So your body is able to tolerate the stress. So you haven't, destroyed your body to the point where you've like tore a muscle or something. And now you're back home with your feet up and resting. But inside of yourself, there's going to be a plethora of biological reactions going on. So hormonal adaptations, nervous system adaptations, and muscle tissue adaptations, which are going to be also, once again, unique to each individual, depending upon your genetics, probably also based upon what your dietary, what your current diet's like as well, and also your current training status, right? So for example, if you've already been training 3 or 4 times during the week and you're completely fatigued, it's going to change that as well. And then the next stage is the exhaustion phase. This is where you probably try and do too much, you become fatigued and ill. And this occurs when the stimulus and stress using training was too much for your body to handle. And like he says here, you usually end up in some form of, I was just going to say chronic, was probably not the right word, but just full body fatigue, potentially ill. And you'll know when you're there, because you'll be, you won't be feeling up for the gym, let's just say, or up to exercising or doing any sort of movement.
Absolutely.
I thought that was quite a useful framework. I mean, it's theoretical, but it's a useful idea to have in your head.
Yes. Yeah. And I think you'll be aware, as long as you kind of like pay attention to your body, then you'll be aware of these kind of 3 stages, right? This shock phase, you adapting, and when you've gone too far and your body is just incapable of, or you're really resisting continued training.
I mean, I was saying this to you literally yesterday, like my body as well. Like I've just taken up doing football twice a week, or for the last month or so. And I basically tried to continue doing the same gym workout routine I was already doing, but obviously with this other 2, relatively intense workouts for my legs and full body for like running around playing football, right? And what I've noticed already is my knees are giving up on me. Like, they're just painful. Like beforehand, I never used to have tweaks. Like, I can walk now, for example, and it's not really painful, but I can tell they're not, 100%. And I haven't had this I didn't have this before I started doing the football. So there's obviously some form of like overtraining that I'm going through. And I've started to realize that sometimes, it's a good idea to listen to your body, because my body's essentially saying to me, stop using your legs so much, put them up and use them for like, a couple of weeks. And recover basically. I'm sure if I did that, I'd be stronger for it. And, I'd probably be able to actually increase my load in the future. But right now they're telling me, give me a break.
No, and I think it is really interesting that, like, there are certain things that you can engage in that can help recovery, right? That can help you still manage to, incur these stresses, but such as sleep, diet, those kinds of things. But there does come a point where, even if you are maxing out on those, that this stress is still wearing you down. And that's when your body just needs like more time to fully recover. Right.
It's back to like the sort of balancing we're just talking about, the homeostasis. And like, let's just say it's like a a level of water and like or like a bucket, and you're slowly dipping into your recovery like sort of trough each time, and you replenish it with your food and stuff, and then you're just never getting back to that sort of original baseline, and you're slowly working your way down into this sort of, you know, like necessary for recovery section, I guess, whatever you call it. But I guess that's the best way to visualize it, and you're basically just not fully getting back to baseline, and then therefore homeostasis is broken.
Absolutely. So he's pointed out 3 laws of progressive overload. He loves his laws. I don't know whether they're like an actual theoretical thing, but so the law of progressive overload must be constant. So he gives that example, like you were talking about, of Milo, the guy lifting the cow. So it's got to be constant. The second one is that it's not linear. The biology of our bodies doesn't work that way. Instead, think of it as occurring in waves. And I thought that was quite interesting, isn't like you're not always going to, every single time you go to the gym, you're going to be able to lift. I have to say,
I found that out recently. It used to be like that, I think, when you start off, but now it's kind of like, I don't know. I don't know if it's the same as you, but it's some weeks I'm doing really well. Some weeks I'm just like, oh, why the hell can't I lift that again?
It's so demoralizing, and I think there's such a big component for like when your ego takes over. So today I was doing like a bent over barbell row, and I think I can lift pretty heavy, but then I was like, I'm not doing these reps properly anymore, right? Like I'm like using too much momentum to go down and lift it up, and I was like, get my fucking ego out the door and drop the weight down. And so it's like, you know, you can convince yourself that you're progressing, but are you progressing in the same state or the same way that you were, you know, a couple of weeks before, when you're properly focusing on form and getting that movement and that neurological patterning, like, you know, down.
That's for sure. But to be fair, the one thing that I always look to, or the one thing I've always kind of come to realize, is I see some of the best physiques or the biggest guys in the gym lifting light. And that's kind of what's reminding me that sometimes, you know, throw your ego out the door. I'm sure this guy can lift way heavier than me, but he's just doing light, and he's just making. I'm watching him. He's just doing, you know, perfect form and stuff. I'm like, okay, that's what, you know. If that guy who's got that physique's doing that, it's probably a good idea to follow suit.
Exactly.
But
and then the last one is that that progressive overload must be specific, and this goes on to this next chapter, which is the law of specificity. And essentially, so he's got here, there's only a certain amount of stress, stimuli, and adaptation energy you can successfully squeeze into 24 hours before you overtrain and visit the exhaustion phase. The law of specific skill is simply the law of progressive overload made specific, the SAID principle. And I've heard about this in, I think, like business and other areas as well, but this idea that like specific adaptations to the SAID principle is specific adaptations to impose demands, and it just means you adapt specifically to the demands you place on your body. So if I want to get better at squatting, then I need to do, you know, barbell squats, right? If that's what I want to improve at, because once again, we're talking about that neurological patterning that's getting like made better and better. You're putting it under stress, so next time you're going to be able to endure more weight, maybe. So it's really important to like be specific about what you want to, you know.
This is the point, isn't it? It's back to like, what goals do you have, right? So if you're somebody who's like, okay, I want to go to the gym because I want to have 6-pack abs, and then also once again, it depends on where your body situation's at, right? Because if you're already lean, then it's probably a lot of developing your abs and doing a lot of ab workouts, right, to actually build the muscle there. But if you're somebody who's overweight and you're not going to be able to see the abs, even if you develop them, the first stage is probably losing weight, right? And once again, it's just basically building your workout program on what you want. So another thing, you could be like, right, maybe I am lean. I want to really improve my shoulders because my shoulders are too narrow or something. I don't know what it is. Then you just work on exercises that you know are going to create the demands to grow your shoulders, right? And then you probably would train that muscle maybe twice a week, because you know that's where you want to place the volume and the intent, maybe you could say, on those, right? Because that's the priority for you right now. And to be honest, I've been slacking in that regard. Sometimes I feel like personally, I need to actually look at myself and go, right, this month I'm going to focus on a different muscle group. I see myself slacking in this, you know. I'm going to do 2 sets of shoulders every week. I don't know. Two training days for shoulders.
No, exactly. And like, you know, he gives a couple of examples. One actually that I'm aware of is, you know, bodybuilders when their whole point is that they need to have this perfect physique and that they need to have proportional aspects to them, then, you know, I remember watching Arnold Schwarzenegger and he was like, oh, my right, you know, rear delt wasn't as good. So, you know, I'd go in, I'd hit that fucking right delt, you know, and because they'd be looking at it and yeah, exactly. And this, but, you know, he gives an example here of like, on a broad level, like doing a triathlon, you know, 20% of it is for is made up of swimming, 50% is cycling, 30% is running. So then your training schedule should reflect that. You should focus 20% on swimming, 50% on cycling, and 30% on running. And it's, you know, the specificity is key. You want to be able to hit those goals, whatever your goal is. You want to be, you know, making sure that you're doing the things that are getting you to that point. Like an extreme example is like Bulgarian training program, which I think was during like the 80s, but they're really well known for like being really good powerlifters or weightlifters. And essentially it's because if you're going to the Olympics and you're being judged on how to, I don't know, I can't remember what it is. It's like either it's like clean and snatch and the jerk, whatever it is, or it's those, you know, squats and stuff like that. If you're being judged just on those movements, then why not do them all the fucking time? What's the point of going off and doing this, right? And so that's what they kind of did for 365 days until, you know, the next time they were at some championship, they would train those specific movements and they would like dominating the weightlifting era for like a good long time.
And it's worth mentioning here, they also did a bunch, it was obviously like high intensity in the sense that they were doing heavy weights, but it was also quite low volume, if that makes sense. Like it's low volume in the sense that what they were doing per day wasn't exactly like doing like 50 reps of their 1 rep max, if that makes sense.
Exactly.
Obviously it taxes your body too much. So they're doing sort of high intensity, low volume, which is kind of like, you know, the gold standard or the whatever you want to call it for strength training. It's, you know, high intensity, low volume, but also high frequency, I guess you could say, like, you know, multiple times a week.
Yes, no, absolutely. So
moving on to the next part, we got the law of recovery. So we got an immune response. So exercise immunology has a quite short history relative to many branches of the exercise sciences. The modern era of careful epidemiological investigations and precise laboratory studies began in the mid-1980s. Most athletes who have experienced immune crash is simply the exhaustion phase that we visited when an attempt to get stronger, quicker, or more powerful from periods of intense, heavy or high volume training have been too much for our bodies to handle. I quite like this J-shaped hypothesis or curve they had as well. So it's essentially, I guess I'm trying to describe it for somebody who's watching. It's got an infection risk on one side of the bar graph, on the graph, and then on the bottom it's got the exercise dose. And the higher the exercise dose, so the more intense it is, the higher your infection risk. And that kind of makes sense, right? If your body has been sufficiently taxed in terms of body damage through exercise, which essentially, you know, when you're working out, that is what it is. You are literally damaging your body for it to repair and be better. It's taking up resources from your immune system, and therefore you're more, you know, prone to being infected, essentially. And there's not really much more to it than that, which is, you know, I guess the more intense you work out and the harder you work out, the more prone to illness you're going to be, and it kind of makes sense.
Exactly. And to literally, like, you know, if you were to push past that point, I don't know why you would. You literally wouldn't be capable of working out, right? Your body is saying, stop, we need a break, I need to fix this, right? This takes priority. And so he kind of goes on in this chapter to talk about how he went and hung out with Wim Hof for a bit. I think most people are kind of familiar, but, you know,
he's become super famous, like ever since, you know, like, well, not since this book. It wasn't this book that made him famous, but like in the last, I don't know, 5 years, he's become mega famous from what I can see.
Yeah, and like essentially he's known as the Iceman. I think he like climbed up Everest just wearing shorts and like no shoes or anything like that. I think it was something ridiculous like that. And you know, the longest ice bath, all these like kind of, you know, ice challenges or world records. He's very, you know, he's the holder of. And he has this kind of method, and essentially there are 2 pillars to it, and it's like breathing and cold therapy. And, you know, we've engaged in a bit of the cold showers, haven't we? And this idea that, you know, it helps, from what I understand and what I've read around, it's essentially like we were talking about with the homeostasis, essentially it's like that with your immune system, and that you're kind of testing it so that it's making it a lot stronger. And, you know, we're able to put up with a lot more like cold exposure. And I think one of the like main things that he's trained himself to be able to do is kind of, manually control his like nervous system to a degree. I can't remember what it said. There's a point around
what is in the Wim Hof.
Yes, yeah. Through these breathing techniques that he talks about, this idea of like essentially what you do is you take like 30 breaths. Essentially, it's kind of like manual hyperventilation, right? And the idea is that it changes the level of pH in your blood because you're getting rid of like a lot of carbon dioxide. Normally there's like a mechanism in place that tells you when you need to breathe again because there's too much carbon dioxide in your blood. So then you need to breathe it out and then breathe in oxygen. But you're manually doing this, and so you're manipulating the level of pH in your blood, and as a result, you get higher hormone, human growth hormone, I think it is.
Okay.
And there are other like benefits to it. But essentially, you can, if you're doing that, let's say you're ill and you engage in this kind of breathing thing, and human growth hormone and these other hormones that you're artificially trying to like activate, then maybe that can help you overcome whatever illness it is. And so this is why it's kind of linked to recovery. I haven't read too much around it, but that's kind of essentially the gist.
Yeah, we could jump into some of the Wim Hof stuff afterwards, potentially in this fitness series, because I'm not too familiar either, and I haven't even tried the breathing exercises. Although, you know, I've seen lots of people sort of swearing by it, or you know, saying it's amazing. So maybe that's something we should do on one of the podcasts. Do a live, because he does say something along the lines of like, don't try it at home, or if you're in a bath, because you might drown, because you might faint or something. So like, you know, that kind of worried me a little bit. Like, am I just going to do this, hyperventilate, and then just faint?
Yeah. No, like I've done it. It's not, you know, it's not like you're going, you know, you're like full on like breathing out and then straight away like full on breathing in. You can feel a little lightheaded. You can feel a bit tingly, and I feel like my body temperature changes, so I get a bit cold.
Okay, interesting. Yeah,
which is just quite interesting.
That is interesting.
But I don't know whether it like you are consciously aware of the difference it makes, but there may be a difference that is occurring in the background because of when.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. I'm sure there is. Once again,
you feel your human growth hormone shoot through the roof.
Yeah. I mean, if you never feel anything like that, you know, it's
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So that was that, and then on to the next chapter, which is this law. Was it the law of more?
Law of more. Yeah. So in my head, this is very similar to progressive overload. To be honest, it's like another level to it, right? Because the law of more is essentially about growing your sort of overall work capacity. So he sort of defines a high work capacity as meaning you can train harder and for longer, and you avoid the exhaustion phase and rarely overtrain. I mean, isn't that like the sort of gold standard, I guess, to the point where, you know, what most people would consider overtraining, you're doing for like a warm up, you know? I think this is kind of the point he's getting to here. So, you know, through many visits from this shock phase to the adaptation phase, the exhaustion phase, and just overall increasing your volume through progressive overload, your volume, intensity, whatever you want to call it, all of the said before areas, you eventually get to the point where you increase your workload, right? And I think it was just the part we introduced is like 1,000 rep workout, or maybe that was in the original one, but that looked pretty hard.
I think it could be. I think essentially, you know, when we were talking about progressive overload, we were naming a bunch of different variables like reps, intensity, sets, all those kinds of things. This, I think, takes one of those, which is like kind of work capacity, and says if you build volume, on this, yeah, exactly. If you build on this, then you can encompass a lot more within and you know, you're much more durable, and you can out-train a lot of people. Like if you think about it, if some people's work capacity is really low, then their competitors are going to, you know, outcompete them because they're able to keep training while others aren't able to, right? If you're able to, you know, recover when you're supposed to, and then really focus on work capacity and getting in a lot of like kind of volumes, like a lot of volume, like you were just saying with doing, what was it, what 1,000 reps was it, or something like that.
Yeah, like a 1,000 rep workout. But I wonder if that was back in the building the body, the very first part. I wonder if it was that or not. But anyway,
but essentially that helps to improve this work capacity and build it, and I think that's quite important for, well, just in general, realistically.
I do think this could have been the chapter of the Everest. I think this might
it
be
was,
for the Everest. So basically, this madman, Ross Edgley, decided to climb up a rope, without any hand, like gloves. Sorry, I don't think he had gloves. At least I think he definitely needed gloves by the end of it. But he climbed the equivalent of Mount Everest on a rope for like 19 hours straight. To the point where he had his hands like just blistering, because obviously you can imagine over the friction over that sort of time carrying, because he's a big guy as well. His, he must be like 90 kg or stuffy at least. And this, he's a crazy, like his story of it, how he said like he had to go for a poo or something. Like I don't know if you remember that part, right at the end, and he basically couldn't even wipe his own bum because his hands were like so blistered, and he's nuts. I just give up at that point, it's just
I don't know, like his mindset must be nuts. Like I think for me it's the swim, think about that. You're doing that for 126 days or whatever it is, 12 hours a day of swimming, 2 bouts of 6 hours of swimming, and that doesn't take into consideration the context of, like, let's say there's a storm and you have to get to a certain place by a certain time, so you have to just continue to swim. And he was saying like sometimes he would have swum for like 6 hours, but because of the current he was further back than when he started. And just like, I don't know what that does to your the mindset to get through that. But essentially in this regard, in this chapter, I think he kind of uses the rope example, the rope experience, as an example of applying all of these like previous laws, and then building this like work capacity into it. So he talks about like okay, first of all, like what was the first law? It was the
in fact you've even got the world's longest climb example in the notes a couple later. Because he was talking, if I remember correctly, about because I was going to bring this up now, which is the how to not have sore muscles by basically focusing on concentric rather than eccentric movement.
Yes,
do you remember
exactly.
that bit?
Which he needed to try, because he needs to try and essentially find a specific program or a specific workout that he was able to, so that when it came to trying to climb this rope for 19 hours or whatever it was, something ridiculous like that, he was able to do it, and he was able to improve his work capacity without like maxing out. And one of the strategies that he used was this idea of, was it concentric?
It was concentric and eccentric,
right? Yeah. Concentric, like contractions, because essentially they don't activate as much, or they don't lead to soreness. Essentially
it doesn't lead to soreness, I believe. So it was definitely to do with soreness rather than like adaptation. But basically his point being, doing this allowed him to train his biceps 7 times a week. So instead of doing a full motion where you're putting the bar down, you're stretching or elongating your muscle, so to speak, which is the eccentric contraction, he was purely focused on the explosive sort of like concentric contraction, which is like the shortening of the muscles. And this allowed him to train his biceps and forearms 7 days a week, because these were the primary muscles he was going to use for this Everest challenge. And this is just an example of how you can build up like a massive work capacity, so to speak. So you can almost, in a way, then go on to maybe another muscle group and focus purely on the concentric rather than the eccentric. And it's funny because I guess people don't think of themselves as doing the eccentric, but whenever you're bringing a bar down, let's just say on a bench press, and you're doing it slower than you're pushing it up, which most people do because it's a lot easier to slowly bring it down than it is to slowly push it up. You're always then training your eccentric. And apparently, according to him, this is where most of the delayed onset muscle soreness and most of the muscle pain actually comes from. And it kind of makes sense, because I don't know about you, but whenever you're sore, I don't really feel sore until I stretch. If I do my eccentric where I'm stretching the muscle again, then I'm like, oh my God, I'm sore. But if I actually just focus on the push, I'm almost like not sore, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. Which is just an interesting, like, I don't know whether I would actively include that into my workouts, because I don't have a need. but it's interesting to just like be aware of, in case you did want to, you know, be able to train more and not like max out or feel sore. Although, considering what we were talking about with what Andy Galpin was talking about, with, you know, muscle soreness isn't like a great indicator of doing a great workout, because it might mean that you've like pushed it too far. But yeah, interesting.
Yeah. And then, I mean, this chapter as well, I'm looking here, you've got stuff about, he has some sort of programs for improving work capacity from beginner to trained athletes. This would be on the book summary, because we could go into specifics, but I don't think it's necessary right now.
No.
You got this like 12-week body weight workout sort of he had as well with the workout training notes. Then I thought he had this quite interesting part about, you know, how to build great abs. And he did a bit about this idea, a bit on the, what's the word? I've got this right here. Activation. So like what actually activates your abs the most. And and basically he kind of came to realize that all the hanging, sort of like hanging exercises tend to work your abs the most. And then he created this idea of like the 4 key principles of ab training, which I thought was really quite interesting, because, you know, we all kind of been, especially with, you know, this classic, get a 6-pack in 6 weeks. The standard exercise is always like 100 crunches, you know, what do you call it? Like the Russian side twist, where you put your hands to side, like that type of thing, and maybe even planking. But he's got some lessons here which are more interesting. So core 1 is like learning to balance, to simply build your core. And I thought this is quite interesting because, you know, even adding a Swiss ball where your feet are on a Swiss ball and you're doing press ups, you're then engaging your core more. So anything to do with obviously stability influences your core. And therefore, this is one of like the key principles of training your abs, right? Like, I don't know about you, I started doing those TRX, you know, those cape things that hang down, and I started doing push-ups on that after doing chest, and then also having my foot on a medicine ball. And like you're trying to balance yourself, not just on the with your chest as well, because your arms are moving up and down, but your body is also trying to like your core, is also tensing up because it's trying to keep your legs in good place. And it's just, that's like an easy, easy thing you can add to any
and
workout.
These like full functioning, like, no, absolutely. And it like kind of re-emphasizes this, like, you know, the importance of doing these full functional movements, right? Because they incorporate everything, right? Rather than these isolated aspects where, like, you know, if you're doing a leg extension, a seated leg extension, you're not really going to be engaging your core as much than if you were to do like a pistol squat, right? Where you've got so much, you need to balance so much, and your core is so important for that.
Which is probably why most people can't do them, right? In my head. So it's one of these things where people think their legs aren't strong enough to do like a pistol squat, let's just say, but it actually probably is the rest of their body being able to balance them so that their leg can solely focus on doing the press, I guess you could say, right? If your legs are good at pressing directly up, but if your core isn't strong enough to keep you directly above your leg, then you're going to be pushing in like a different angle, right? And therefore you can't do it. So I wonder if it is a level of sort of like just the biomechanics just don't make sense.
Probably. I would assume so. And then this core, so the core principle 2, so learn to hold and do nothing, essentially. Like, I've always kind of tried to go for these. Like, I don't really train core very often, but if I do, a lot of it is based on like hanging. So like hanging and doing like L sits or V sits or you know, knee raises or toes to bar or whatever, because it's just, I feel like you really emphasize all of your abs rather than just like, you know, if you're doing a crunch, it's normally the top 4 or like, you know, the upper abs.
And then literally off the back of that, you got here core principle, learn to hang, which is pretty much the same thing. So doing anything involved with sort of hanging from like a bar, and then doing, you know, V sits, L sits from that, or doing crunches based when you're hanging, engages your whole core. And then obviously you've got this core principle 4, which is learn to control. So this is, you know, I guess controlling the movements you're doing with this as well. So it's not just, you know, explosive movements, so to speak, with your core. It's like learning to control slowly you coming down. And I think he used that like dragon flag example, which is I think you hold yourself firm with the top half of your body, and then you sort of make yourself into this
slightly lower.
So like it's almost like a lever. But
I think it's really interesting. Like when I went to I don't go so often anymore, but when I was doing a bit of gymnastics, the way that they told you to engage your core was differently than the way that I would normally. And it really just emphasized it a lot more. So like if I'm doing a plank and it's like I need to like almost pretend like I've got a belt around me. And this is actually essentially why there are belts in the gym, right? So you kind of get this proprioception feedback. Because if like I engage, if I go like, huh, right, then it's as if I'm like pushing this belt out around my waist or around my like stomach. And essentially you want to be able to like really control that like kind of contraction, and that is the kind of contraction you want in place. Yeah, it's Andy Galpin was talking about it on his in the podcast. But essentially, if you can do that and you can perform, these exercises, or you can continue to talk while it's like still firm, then you're on the right path. But essentially, if it's contracted like that and then you perform these movements, it's much better. It's hitting it in a much better way than other people, and how like, because there are different ways that you can kind of contract.
It's almost like, but it's like functional movement though. You're teaching it to be active when you're doing these other movements, and obviously building up a strong core with those other movements are going to help with overall strength, I can imagine.
Absolutely. So that was that chapter, and that's the end of part 1. Hey guys, well there you have it. We hope you enjoyed that book summary. Now we know it can be a lot to take in all at once, so if you want to be able to read this in a more palatable size, or you want to be able to implement any of those key actionable ideas that we were talking about in this episode, head on over to our website at wisewords.blog, where the book summary will be waiting for you. Also, don't forget to check out our socials, as we consistently upload the key ideas, benefits, and actionable ideas from all the books that we read. The links to those will be in the description below. Now, we want to be able to get you the best content in a way that's really easy to understand, but we need your help. Your opinion matters. So you are our feedback mechanism. And with those quick actions, whether that's leaving us a like or a dislike, commenting in the comment section below, or subscribing to our channel, all of those help us gauge what we're doing well and how to improve on our method of delivery. So if you have any thoughts on the matter, don't hesitate to act. It takes less than 10 seconds and it really helps us out. But with all that being said, until next time, stay wise.